Pause for a moment and don't rush past this. If this message has reached you today, it may not be as random as it looks. Not just another post in a feed, not just another passing thought. Something in you might have been quietly looking for this exact kind of reflection, and somehow it has landed here in front of you. So stay with this for a little while. Think of that one person right now. Let their image come forward in your mind without forcing it. And as they appear, pay attention to what shifts inside you. That subtle tightening in the chest, the warmth that shows up without permission, the mix of longing, tenderness, confusion, maybe even ache. That response is not confusion, it is recognition. Something in you is responding before your thoughts can explain it. Because this person is not just another figure in your life story. On a deeper emotional level, there may already be something within you that feels strangely familiar with them, as if your inner world has already begun to organize itself around this connection. And I know how heavy that can feel, how draining it becomes when love lives in uncertainty. When you are left wondering at night whether you are reading too much into things, whether the signs mean anything at all, whether the feeling inside you has somewhere to go or will just stay suspended without resolution. It matters more than your mind is telling you right now. You are not being foolish for feeling deeply. You are not too emotional or overreacting. You are standing inside an experience that has emotional depth and psychological weight, even if it hasn't taken clear shape yet. And that is exactly why it feels so unstable. Because these kinds of connections don't stay on the surface. They don't just touch your preferences or your daily routine. They reach into older layers of you. The parts that learned how to protect themselves. The parts that learned how to survive emotional uncertainty. The parts that learned how to earn love instead of simply receive it. Many people imagine love as something that should feel instantly peaceful, like finally reaching calm ground after chaos. But the connections that actually change us rarely begin that way. They often arrive like disruption before they become clarity. They shake the structure you built your emotional life on, your habits of coping, your patterns of control, your need to overgive, overthink, overextend just to keep someone close. And when those patterns get disrupted, it can feel like things are breaking apart rather than coming together. When someone touches places in you that others never reached, your usual defenses stop working smoothly. The one who tends to overgive suddenly sees how much exhaustion has been hidden underneath their effort. They start to notice how often they equated love with proving themselves, with being patient beyond their limits, with sacrificing their own needs just to avoid being left. And that realization is uncomfortable because it challenges something they may have believed for years, that love must be earned through endurance. At the same time, the other side of this dynamic carries its own internal struggle. The one who withdraws often learns to associate closeness with emotional risk, with loss of control, with disappointment or overwhelm. So when feelings deepen, their instinct is to step back, not because the connection is meaningless, but because it feels too intense to hold safely. From the outside, it looks like one person is chasing while the other is pulling away. But underneath that surface story, it is often two nervous systems reacting differently to the same emotional fear. Fear of rejection, fear of inadequacy, fear of being too much or not enough. The one who pursues begins to believe that love will disappear the moment they stop trying. Silence feels threatening. Distance feels like abandonment in progress. But they eventually have to learn something important. That abandoning themselves to keep someone close is too high a cost. Their worth is not measured by how much they endure for connection, and the one who withdraws often discovers something unexpected as well. That distance does not bring the relief they hoped for. Instead, it brings reflection. It brings emptiness. It brings awareness of what they actually feel once the noise settles. Avoidance can delay pain, but it also delays intimacy. And healing rarely looks clean at the beginning. Sometimes it looks like inconsistency, sometimes confusion, sometimes emotional silence, sometimes returning and pulling away again while someone tries to understand what is happening inside them. But transformation has always started in disorder before it becomes clarity, like something dissolving before it reforms into something new. This is why these connections feel so overwhelming. They expose the contradiction inside human longing, the desire to be close and the fear of what closeness might require, the need for connection and the fear of losing yourself within it. Attachment says, I need you so I can feel complete, but deeper emotional maturity slowly begins to say, I can care for you without losing myself in the process, and that shift changes everything. Because at some point in this experience, there is always a turning point, and it does not usually come from a perfect conversation or from hearing exactly what you wanted to hear. It comes from something quieter, a decision inside you. The moment you stop waiting endlessly to be chosen and start choosing yourself again. When that happens, something subtle but real begins to shift in the dynamic. Not because you are manipulating anything, not because you are trying to control an outcome, but because your energy is no longer coming from fear. You stop reaching from anxiety. You stop trying to secure certainty from uncertainty. And for the first time, the connection is no longer being shaped only by pursuit and withdrawal. There is space. And in that space, the other person is left alone with what they genuinely feel, without pressure, without reaction, without escape. And what is there may have never truly disappeared. Trust this as much as you can right now. Nothing you have felt in this waiting period has been wasted. Not the overthinking, not the longing, not the nights where your mind kept returning to them, not the moments where you questioned everything you felt. It has all shaped you. Even when it felt like nothing was happening, something was forming inside you, a deeper capacity to feel, a deeper awareness of your own patterns, a deeper understanding of what love is and what it is not. That love you have carried is not lost. It has not vanished into emptiness. It has changed you in ways you are only beginning to understand. And even the pain carries meaning. Because when something hurts and still matters to you, it shows you that your heart is still open enough to care deeply instead of shutting down completely. That is not weakness. That is emotional depth. And not everyone stays open in that way. It is not dramatic. It is subtle at first, almost easy to miss. You start noticing that the urgency inside you doesn't feel as sharp as it used to. The same thoughts still appear, but they don't grip you in the same way. The emotional intensity begins to loosen its hold, not because your feelings disappear, but because your attention is no longer completely trapped inside them, and in that space, something important starts to return. You. Not the version of you that exists in relation to someone else, not the version of you that is constantly interpreting silence, decoding distance, or waiting for meaning to be confirmed, but the version of you that existed before all of that began to take up so much internal space. This is what people often don't expect about healing. It doesn't always feel like gaining something new. Sometimes it feels like slowly getting yourself back. And when that begins to happen, the entire emotional structure shifts. The connection that once felt like it was controlling your inner world starts to take its proper place again. It becomes part of your life, not the center of it. It stops being the force that defines your mood, your direction, your sense of worth. Because your worth was never meant to be measured through someone else's attention, availability, or emotional clarity. You begin to see that more clearly now, not as an idea you repeat to yourself, but as something you start to feel in small, practical moments. When you choose rest instead of overthinking. When you choose your own plans instead of waiting for uncertain outcomes. When you choose your own peace even while emotions are still present. That is where real change begins. Not in forcing yourself to stop caring, but in refusing to abandon yourself while you care. And slowly, without you needing to aggressively push anything away, the emotional dependency begins to dissolve. What remains is something calmer, more grounded, more self-aware. You still feel, but you are no longer lost inside what you feel. And that changes everything. Because from that place, love is no longer an act of chasing or proving or enduring. It becomes a choice made from stability rather than fear, from wholeness rather than lack, from clarity rather than confusion. And whether this specific connection continues, shifts, or fades into memory, you will no longer meet it from the same place you once did. That is the real turning point, not when someone finally understands you, not when they finally respond differently, not when the uncertainty disappears, but when you no longer lose yourself inside uncertainty. So you continue forward, not by shutting your heart down, but by strengthening your relationship with it. You learn to stay open without becoming unsteady. You learn to care without collapsing into waiting. You learn to love without disappearing into the other person. And in time, something very quiet becomes obvious. What is meant for you has never asked you to become smaller in order to carry it. It does not require you to compress your emotions, reduce your expectations, or quietly abandon parts of yourself just to make the connection feel more manageable. It does not depend on you constantly adjusting, overextending, or reshaping your inner world until it fits something that was never aligned with you in the first place. And this is something that becomes clearer with time, not all at once. At first, you may not notice it. You may interpret your discomfort as something you need to fix within yourself. You may assume that if something feels heavy or uncertain, the solution is to try harder, understand more, wait longer, or become more patient than your own nervous system can comfortably hold. But over time, something begins to shift in how you see things. You start recognizing that certain experiences do not become lighter no matter how much effort you pour into them. Certain dynamics do not become clearer just because you analyze them more deeply. Certain connections do not stabilize simply because you invest more of yourself into them. And slowly, a different kind of awareness begins to emerge. You realize that alignment has a distinct feeling. It does not constantly pull you away from yourself. It does not require you to override your intuition in order to maintain hope. It does not keep you in a state where you are repeatedly trying to translate confusion into meaning, as though clarity is something you must earn through endurance. Instead, it feels grounded. Even when it is uncertain, it does not destabilize your sense of self. Even when it is developing, it does not disconnect you from your own emotional center. And this contrast becomes very important. Because once you have felt both, you begin to understand that confusion is not always a phase. Sometimes it is a pattern. Sometimes it is information. Sometimes it is your system telling you that you are investing energy into something that does not offer the same stability back. Not everything that feels meaningful is meant to be sustained in your life. And not everything that is intense is necessarily aligned. This is where your relationship with yourself begins to deepen in a different way. You stop trying to negotiate with your discomfort. You stop trying to reinterpret your intuition into something more acceptable. You stop treating emotional instability as something you must tolerate in order to prove loyalty, patience, or depth. Instead, you begin to recognize that your inner experience is not an obstacle to love. It is a guide toward it. And this changes the way you move through connection entirely. You are no longer trying to become enough for something that consistently makes you feel less like yourself. You are no longer shrinking your emotional needs just to avoid losing access to something uncertain. You are no longer treating inconsistency as something you must adapt to in order to preserve possibility. Instead, you begin to return to yourself as the reference point, not as a defensive position, but as a stable one. And from there, your perception becomes clearer. You start noticing that anything requiring you to repeatedly disconnect from your own sense of truth is not asking for growth. It is asking for self-abandonment in subtle forms. And anything that aligns with you does not feel like constant internal negotiation. It may still involve effort, yes. It may still involve vulnerability, yes. But it does not require you to lose your center in order to stay connected to it. This is where real clarity begins to take shape, not as a sudden revelation, but as a quiet settling inside you, a recognition that you do not need to become less in order for something to remain in your life. You do not need to reduce your emotional depth to be accepted. You do not need to silence your intuition to maintain connection. You do not need to question your own perception just to keep something from falling apart. And once that understanding takes root, something very subtle begins to change in how you relate to everything. You become less reactive to uncertainty. You become less willing to overinvest in ambiguity. You become less available to dynamics that require you to continuously override yourself, not out of rejection, but out of recognition. Because you begin to see that real connection does not demand self-erasure. It allows presence without distortion. It allows honesty without fear. It allows you to remain fully yourself without having to negotiate your worth in the process. And so, You move differently, not urgently, not defensively, but with a quieter kind of strength. A strength that does not come from forcing outcomes, but from no longer abandoning yourself inside them. And as you continue in this way, something becomes undeniable. What is meant for you does not ask you to become smaller. It meets you where you already are. And everything that cannot meet you there begins to loosen its hold, not through struggle, but through clarity. So you do not need to chase. You do not need to shrink. You do not need to prove your place in something that was never designed to hold your full presence. You simply need to remain where you are most honest with yourself. And from there, life becomes much simpler to read. Not because everything is perfect, but because you are no longer losing yourself in what is unclear. To Jungian truths. But there is something most people do not understand about this process. It does not feel like growth while it is happening. It often feels like uncertainty, like delay, like nothing is moving the way you hoped it would. You still have questions. You still have moments where old patterns try to pull you back in. You still feel the urge to overthink, to check, to interpret silence as meaning something about you. And yet, the difference is not in the absence of those feelings. The difference is in what you do after they appear. At some point, you stop letting those feelings take over the steering wheel of your life. You notice them, but you do not obey them instantly. You pause, even if only for a moment, before reacting. And in that pause, something new is forming inside you. That pause is where self-respect begins to replace self-abandonment. It is where you start choosing yourself in ways that are not loud or dramatic, but deeply structural. You do not announce it to anyone. You do not even fully explain it to yourself. But your behavior starts to shift in ways that your old self would not have recognized. You stop overextending to maintain access to someone who is inconsistent. You stop rewriting your own intuition just to make someone else's behavior make sense. You stop treating emotional confusion as something you must solve immediately instead of something you are allowed to simply step back from. And slowly, your nervous system begins to learn something new. It learns that not every silence needs to be filled. It learns that not every uncertainty needs to be decoded. It learns that your value does not increase or decrease based on someone else's ability to show up consistently. This is not something you force. It is something that becomes you through repetition, through small decisions that no one else sees, through choosing not to spiral when you used to spiral automatically, through choosing not to chase clarity in places where clarity has repeatedly not been offered. And over time, those small choices accumulate into a completely different emotional identity. You begin to notice that your inner world is less reactive than it used to be. Not because life became easier, but because you became steadier. And this steadiness changes everything about how you relate to love, connection, and uncertainty. Because now, you are no longer approaching relationships from a place of emotional hunger disguised as patience. You are not trying to earn consistency through endurance. You are not trying to prove your worth through understanding someone who refuses to meet you halfway. Instead, you begin to see things more clearly, even when clarity is uncomfortable. You start recognizing that confusion, when it is persistent, is also information. That inconsistency, when it repeats, is also communication, and that your nervous system is not something to override just to keep hope alive. It is something to listen to, something that often tells the truth before your mind is ready to accept it. And as this awareness deepens, something very quiet but very powerful happens. You begin to detach from the idea that love must be proven through emotional struggle. You stop equating intensity with meaning. You stop confusing anxiety with connection. You stop believing that the more you suffer emotionally, the more real something must be. And instead, you start noticing a different kind of truth. That real connection does not constantly destabilize you. It may move you. It may challenge you. It may even stretch parts of you that were previously closed. But it does not repeatedly disconnect you from yourself. It does not require you to abandon your own center in order to stay inside it. And when you begin to understand that, your entire standard for connection shifts. You no longer ask, "How do I make this work?" You begin asking, "How do I stay aligned with myself while I observe what this is. That shift changes everything, because now you are no longer trying to control outcomes through effort, anxiety, or emotional overinvestment. You are simply staying present long enough to see what is actually real. And in that presence, illusions start to lose their power. What was once confusing becomes clearer, not because it changed, but because you are no longer distorting it with hope alone. What was once consuming becomes smaller, not because it intensified, but because you stopped feeding it with your own instability. And this is where something very important begins to emerge. You start trusting your own inner signals again. Not perfectly, not all at once, but gradually, consistently. You begin to believe what you feel without needing external validation to confirm it. You begin to respect your discomfort instead of dismissing it. You begin to understand that peace is not something you arrive at after everything is resolved. It is something you protect even while things remain unresolved. And from that place, you become very difficult to mislead emotionally. Not because you are closed off, but because you are grounded. Not because you feel less, but because you no longer lose yourself inside what you feel. And so life begins to respond differently to you, not in a mystical way, but in a psychological one. You start noticing that the kinds of connections that require your self-abandonment no longer hold the same grip. They do not feel as magnetic as they once did. They do not pull you into the same internal chaos. They begin to feel what they actually are: unstable, misaligned, and unsustainable for the version of you that is forming. And in their place, something else becomes more noticeable. Connections that feel quieter, clearer, less dramatic, but more steady. Not because they are perfect, but because they do not require you to disappear in order to participate in them. And slowly, without forcing it, your life begins to reorganize itself around this new internal standard. Not through effort alone, but through awareness, through repetition, through returning to yourself again and again, until that return becomes your natural direction. And when that happens, you realize something very simple, but very profound. You were never meant to live in emotional confusion as a permanent state. You were meant to learn from it and then move beyond it, not by shutting down your capacity to feel, but by refining your capacity to stay connected to yourself while you feel everything fully. And from that place, life becomes less about chasing certainty and more about recognizing alignment when it quietly arrives, not as something overwhelming, but as something that finally does not cost you your peace. Jungian truths.